This mini webinar is on writing the text for your History Day project, and it's brought to you by Maryland Humanities for the Teaching with Primary Sources Summer Teacher Institute. Hi, this is Leah. In this webinar, I'll give some tips for how to guide your students as they do the writing for their project. But first, I want to ask the teachers, what worrying trends do you see in your students' writing? If you like, you can pause the video here and jot down a few things. In this video, we'll be thinking through how we can combat those trends. I'm curious what you wrote down or what comes to your mind when you think about your students' writing, but I'll share with you some of the trends that the Maryland History Day team has noticed in History Day projects. So the first one that I've got is having large sections of paraphrased text, usually from secondary sources, having secondary source quotes or quotes that are too long, having a lot of fun facts, early life bio information, going on tangents, projects that read like an encyclopedia entry. In other words, it's all facts and just listing events that happened. And some students have trouble incorporating primary source evidence into their project. If you've seen any of these in your students' history research writing, I hope the following slides will help you start to combat those trends and guide them in the right direction. If students are having trouble using primary sources or having trouble getting started with the writing in general, this tip starts even before the writing process. Good planning will set students up for success when they get to the writing. Graphic organizers like the one on the left are a great way to get started. This one automatically gives students a structure to follow. And just to show you close up, you can see here each section has prompt questions to get students thinking about what information should go there. If you have students who are learning English or reading below grade level, this type of scaffolding will be important as they get started with the project. Their text might start as a complete sentence answer to the prompt questions, and then it can grow as they provide evidence for each answer. Another way to plan projects, perhaps after brainstorming with the graphic organizer, is through an outline. The outline allows students to get more detailed in their planning. The more detailed their outlines are, the easier it will be for them to turn those notes into writing. They can also use the outline to plan where they will bring in information and quotes from primary sources, which will make it easier to see the evidence of primary source use in the final text. There are a few things students need to be reminded of when they're doing their writing. If they are having issues with paraphrasing too much, using secondary source quotes, or writing a text that reads like an encyclopedia entry, they need to be reminded of the importance of student analysis in this project. One general piece of advice we give is not to let other historians tell the story for you. The student is a historian in this case, so we want their voice to come through. And as the historians of their project, the conclusions they come to should come from the primary sources as much as possible. So students must think about how those primary sources support the claims that they're trying to make. Primary sources must be the evidence here, not secondary sources. Encourage students to take effective notes from a variety of sources to prevent them from leaning too heavily on one source or paraphrasing too heavily. Students can add their own interpretations as they take notes to make it easier to incorporate their views as they write. Students can also see for themselves whether most of the notes they took that they plan to use come from secondary or primary sources. If most of their notes are from secondary sources, they may need to go back and balance their research with primary sources. Another place they might keep track of their own interpretations is in their annotated bibliography. We ask students to write a sentence about how each source fits into the project. Determining how it fits into the project is in itself a small piece of analysis. If they're able to tell you how a source answers their research question in an annotation, they should be able to use that interpretation and incorporate it into the body of the project. Finally, you might encourage unique angles on a well-covered topic. The more popular and well-known a topic is, the easier secondary source material will be to come across, and the harder it will be for students to come to their own conclusions. especially if it's a topic they learned about in school and the analysis has been given to them. They already have their conclusions ready to go before looking at the primary sources. So instead of doing a project on the fall of the Berlin Wall, for example, they can pick a small piece of that story, like the Monday demonstrations in East Germany, the experience of families separated by the wall, or the reactions to the fall of the Berlin Wall in the US. Since they're not tasked with telling a big mainstream story, there might be more room for them to make their own analyses of impacts of those stories. If your student's work is full of fun facts and tangents and lacks a clear argument throughout, the advice that we give is to kill your darlings. This is, of course, a piece of popular writing advice that has been used for many decades that suggests that sometimes to shape your writing and come to a better final product, you may need to cut out some things that you wrote that you really like or that you're proud of. The main advice here is to read back over the text and make sure everything you wrote supports your main argument. Some of it might be background information to help your reader understand the main event of your argument about it, and a limited amount of that type of information can stay. But if it doesn't help us understand the main event, it probably doesn't need to be there. For example, we don't need to know that George Washington had 5 siblings to understand what he did later in his life. This may include your student cutting out things that they personally find interesting, which can be difficult and disappointing. Part of the reason for cutting writing is that History Day has word limits for every type of project, so students really need to make the most of every sentence. I like to use the exhibit as an example since the maximum is only 500 words. They have a very small space to make their point and support their argument. If the student goes on a 100-word tangent, then they've missed that opportunity to strengthen their argument. The practice of cutting text that doesn't support the thesis will lead to a more focused History Day project, and it is a good lesson in putting together a strong and cohesive historical argument. However, like in any part of this project, you have to know your students and meet them where they are. Having them remove what are for them the most fun parts of the project might destroy their motivation. And in that case, it might not be worth it to be firm in that advice. One of the great benefits of History Day is that students can come away from it with a positive regard for studying history and doing research. And sometimes, especially for younger students, that outcome is more important than aiming for perfection. Finally, I know that the History Day project is very intensive for the teacher as well as the student. There are periodic checkpoint assignments that should be turned into the teacher, like the preliminary bibliography, thesis worksheets, outlines, and text drafts, and that becomes a lot for the teacher to mark up and give feedback on as thoroughly as they might like. The teacher's guidance will always be a part of History Day, especially in helping students acquire the skills that they'll need, but we encourage you to find ways to take part of the burden of feedback off of you as the teacher. One recommendation is to allow students to enable the Grammarly extension on their school devices. Grammarly is a grammar and spell check tool that I've seen many students and English learners using. And since it's an internet extension, it works in Google Docs if that's where they're saving their work. It also works for anything else that they might type online, like emails. There's also a spelling and grammar tool in Microsoft Word if that's where they're doing their work. Another tip is to have students check their own work before turning it in. They can use the judging rubric criteria as a checklist to make sure they have all the components they need, or have them perform a peer review. This can be done throughout the process to check each other's thesis statements, bibliographies, and other assignments using checklists. Students may be shy to critique their peers at first, but peer feedback is a skill in collaboration that they will use in college and in their careers, and it takes practice, just as self-review and self-reflection do. Make sure to leave plenty of time between the first draft due date and the final project due date. Students will need time to do these peer and self-reviews, and they'll need time to make the suggested changes and to continue to revise. That's all the writing advice we have for now. We hope you find this useful for writing history research projects with your students, and thanks for watching.